Nancy Martinez stood behind the register of Thompson's General Store, scanning groceries with the practiced ease of someone who had done this thousands of times before. The rhythmic beep of the scanner was oddly comforting, predictable in a way that life had not been for many years. At 48 years old, Nancy had the kind of face that suggested she had lived through more than most people her age. Fine lines traced the corners of her eyes, not from laughter, but from years of squinting through dust and debris. Her hands, though they now handled cans of soup and boxes of cereal, still bore the calluses of her former life. "That'll be $32.45, Mrs. Chen," Nancy said with a practiced smile. Mrs. Chen, a regular customer, fumbled with her wallet. "Such a lovely day today, isn't it, Nancy?" "It certainly is," Nancy replied, though she barely noticed the weather anymore. Every day was the same in Millbrook, and that was exactly how she wanted it. 5 years had passed since Nancy had walked away from disaster relief work. 5 years since the earthquake that had changed everything. 5 years since she had heard those voices. The voices still haunted her dreams. Desperate cries from beneath tons of concrete and steel, growing weaker with each passing hour. Nancy had been among the first responders to arrive at the collapsed apartment building, and she had heard them immediately. A woman calling for help, a man shouting his children's names, the terrified sobbing of someone trapped in the darkness. But the rescue teams had been delayed. Equipment problems, miscommunication, bureaucratic confusion. By the time they had finally begun the extraction process, it was too late. The voices had fallen silent, one by one, like candles being snuffed out in the dark. Nancy had found the woman herself, buried under what had once been her kitchen. The woman's hand had still been reaching upward, as if she had believed until her final moment that someone would pull her free. Nancy had held that cold hand and wept, something she had never done on a job site before. She left disaster relief work the next day. She could not bear the thought of hearing those voices again, of feeling that helpless again. She moved to Millbrook, a town so small and quiet that disasters seemed impossible. She took the job at Thompson's, rented a small apartment above the hardware store, and built a life of careful routine and deliberate calm. "Nancy? Nancy, are you all right?" Mrs. Chen's voice pulled Nancy back to the present. She realized she had been staring at the register, her hand frozen over the payment screen. "Oh yes, sorry. Just lost in thought for a moment." Nancy completed the transaction and handed Mrs. Chen her receipt. As Mrs. Chen left, Nancy took a deep breath and steadied herself. The memories came less frequently now, but they never truly went away. She glanced at the clock. Another 4 hours until closing time. 4 more hours of the comforting monotony that kept her mind occupied and her past at bay. The bell above the door chimed, and a young man entered. Nancy recognized him as one of the workers from the new construction company that had come to Millbrook 6 months ago. Riverside Construction, they called themselves. They had arrived with big promises of affordable housing and community development. "Just need some water and snacks," the young man said, making his way to the refrigerated section. Nancy nodded and watched as he selected several bottles of water and a bag of chips. As he approached the counter, she noticed the dust on his clothes and the exhaustion in his eyes. "Long day?" she asked as she scanned his items. "You have no idea," he said with a tired laugh. "Boss is pushing us hard to finish the Maple Street project, says we're behind schedule." Nancy had seen the Maple Street project, 3 large residential buildings side by side, already sold to families eager for new homes. The buildings had gone up remarkably fast, which had impressed many in the town, but Nancy had found it concerning. "That's quite an undertaking," Nancy said carefully. "Those buildings went up quickly." The young man's expression shifted slightly. "Yeah, well, when you cut corners, things move faster." Nancy's hands stilled. "Cut corners? What do you mean?" The young man glanced toward the door, then lowered his voice. Look, I probably shouldn't say anything, but this job isn't what I thought it would be. The boss, Mr. Hendricks, he's been substituting cheap materials everywhere. The concrete mix isn't up to code. The rebar spacing is all wrong. And I'm pretty sure he's pocketing the difference. A cold feeling settled in Nancy's stomach. Have you reported this to anyone? The young man shook his head. I need this job. And who would believe me anyway? Hendricks is tight with the mayor and the building inspector. I'm just a laborer. He paid for his items and left quickly, leaving Nancy standing alone with a growing sense of dread. She tried to push the feeling away, tried to tell herself it was not her problem, that she had left that life behind. But something deep inside her, something she had tried to bury for 5 years, was stirring to life. That evening, after closing the store, Nancy found herself walking down Maple Street. The 3 new buildings stood tall and proud in the fading light, their fresh paint gleaming. Families were already moving in. She could see lights in several windows, hear the sounds of children playing in the courtyards between the buildings. Nancy walked closer, examining the exterior with the trained eye she had once used to assess disaster sites. What she saw made her blood run cold. The mortar between the bricks was already crumbling in places. The foundation showed signs of settling that should not have been visible in such a new structure. When she placed her hand against the wall, she could feel it give slightly under pressure. These buildings were not safe. She circled the perimeter slowly, taking mental notes of every flaw she observed. The drainage system appeared inadequate. The load-bearing walls showed hairline cracks. The balconies on the upper floors seemed to sag ever so slightly. Each observation confirmed her worst fears. Nancy stood there for a long moment, paralyzed by indecision. She had spent 5 years running from responsibility, from the weight of other people's lives. She had built a quiet existence specifically to avoid moments like this, but she could not walk away. Not this time. She pulled out her phone and took photographs of the visible defects, documenting everything she could see. The failing mortar, the settling foundation, the inadequate drainage. She would need evidence when she reported this. The next morning, Nancy went to the town hall. She waited in the lobby for 20 minutes before being shown into the office of Mayor Patricia Downing, a woman in her 60s who had led Millbrook for the past 12 years. Nancy Martinez, isn't it? Mayor Downing said pleasantly. From Thompson's. What can I do for you? Nancy took a seat and explained what she had learned, what she had observed. She described the workers' concerns, pointed out the visible flaws in the construction, and emphasized her background in disaster relief work. She showed the mayor the photographs on her phone, explaining each defect in technical detail. Mayor Downing listened with an expression of polite attention that gradually shifted to one of mild annoyance. When Nancy finished, the mayor leaned back in her chair and smiled a smile that did not reach her eyes. Nancy, I appreciate your concern. Truly I do. But Riverside Construction has all the proper permits and inspections. Building Inspector Davis has personally reviewed their work multiple times. These buildings meet all required standards. But Mayor, if you would just look at the structures yourself— Nancy, the mayor interrupted, her voice firmer now. Mr. Hendricks and his company have brought jobs and affordable housing to this community. We're lucky to have them. I will not jeopardize that relationship based on the observations of someone who, forgive me for saying, is a grocery store clerk, not a building inspector. The dismissal stung, but Nancy pressed on. I'm not just a clerk. I worked in disaster relief for 15 years. I know what unsafe structures look like. And I'm sure that experience was valuable in whatever disasters you dealt with. But this is a small town with perfectly adequate building codes and inspection processes. I think you might be seeing problems where none exist. Nancy felt anger rising in her chest, an emotion she had kept carefully contained for years. People are living in those buildings. Families, children. If something happens, nothing is going to happen, Mayor Downing said with finality. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have another appointment. Thank you for your time, Nancy. Nancy left the town hall feeling frustrated and helpless. She spent the rest of the day going through the motions at the store, her mind churning with worry. That evening, she drove to the county seat, 30 miles away, and spent hours navigating the bureaucracy of the county building department. She filled out complaint forms. She spoke with inspectors who seemed skeptical but promised to look into the matter. She provided photographs she had taken of the visible defects. She emailed copies of everything to the county engineer's office. She did everything she could think of to sound the alarm. Days passed, then a week. Nancy heard nothing back from the county. She called twice and was told her complaint was being reviewed. She asked the mayor's office if county inspectors had visited, but was told no one had come. She watched the 3 buildings on Maple Street every day on her way to and from work, watched more families move in, watched children ride their bikes in the courtyards. The anxiety kept her awake at night. She found herself checking news reports compulsively, terrified that she would wake up one morning to learn the buildings had collapsed. She started having nightmares again, not just about the earthquake from 5 years ago, but about those 3 buildings on Maple Street, about families trapped in rubble, about voices calling for help that would come too late. The young construction worker came into the store again 2 weeks after their first conversation. Nancy asked him about the situation. "Hendricks finished the job," he said quietly. "We've moved on to a new project on the other side of town. Same problems, same shortcuts, but what can I do? I tried to say something to the foreman, and he threatened to fire me." Nancy felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her again, familiar and suffocating. She had tried to warn people. She had followed the proper channels. What more could she do? Maybe the mayor was right. Maybe she was seeing problems where none existed. Maybe 5 years of trying to forget had made her paranoid. But late at night, when she lay in her small apartment above the hardware store, Nancy could hear those voices again. The voices from 5 years ago, crying for help that came too late. And now she imagined new voices, the voices of the families sleeping in those 3 buildings on Maple Street, unaware of the danger that might be surrounding them. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it brought dreams of crumbling concrete and reaching hands.
3 weeks after Nancy's unsuccessful attempts to raise the alarm, she had fallen into an uneasy acceptance of the situation. She told herself that perhaps she had been wrong, that her trauma had made her see danger where none existed. The buildings still stood. Families went about their daily lives. Nothing happened. But the unease never left her. Every morning when she walked to work, she glanced at the 3 buildings on Maple Street. Every evening when she returned home, she looked again. She was watching and waiting for something she desperately hoped would never come. It was a Tuesday night when her worst fears materialized. Nancy had been asleep for perhaps 2 hours when a sound jolted her awake. It was distant but unmistakable, a deep, rumbling groan that seemed to come from the earth itself, followed by a tremendous crash that shook the windows of her apartment.
She was out of bed and at the window in seconds, her heart pounding. In the distance, perhaps half a mile away, a massive cloud of dust was rising into the night sky, illuminated by streetlights. She knew immediately what had happened, even before her conscious mind could process it. The buildings on Maple Street had collapsed. For a moment, Nancy stood frozen at the window, transported back 5 years to another night, another disaster. The paralysis of that memory gripped her, threatened to root her to the spot. Her hands trembled. Her breathing came in short gasps. The old fear tried to pull her under, tried to keep her safe in her apartment, away from the horror that awaited. But then she heard it, faint but unmistakable, carried on the night air. Voices, crying for help. Something broke inside Nancy, or perhaps something that had been broken finally mended. The fear was still there, sharp and overwhelming, but beneath it was something stronger. Purpose, training, the knowledge that people needed her, and this time she would not be too late. She pulled on clothes with trembling hands, grabbed her phone, and ran down the stairs and out into the street. She was running toward the dust cloud, running toward the voices, running toward everything she had spent 5 years trying to escape. Other people were emerging from their homes, confused and frightened. Nancy's training kicked in, pushing through the fog of fear. She had done this before. She knew what needed to happen. "Call 911, she shouted to a man standing in his doorway. "Tell them we have a major building collapse on Maple Street, multiple structures, multiple casualties." She kept running. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but she did not slow down. As she got closer, the full scope of the disaster came into view, and it was worse than she had imagined. All 3 buildings had collapsed, not individually, but together, falling inward toward each other like dominoes. The structures had come down in a cascade of failure, each one pulling the others down with it. Where there had once been 3 6-story residential buildings, there was now a massive pile of rubble, twisted metal, and broken concrete stretching across the entire block. The dust was still settling, creating an eerie fog that hung in the air. Car alarms were blaring. Somewhere in the distance, a dog was barking frantically. And beneath all of that noise, Nancy could hear them, the voices, people trapped in the rubble calling for help. Nancy reached the edge of the debris field and stopped, forcing herself to think clearly. This was the moment she had been dreading for 5 years, but it was also the moment she had been training for throughout her entire career. The skills were still there, buried beneath layers of fear and trauma. She just had to trust them. People were gathering now, dozens of residents from the surrounding streets, all staring in horror at the destruction. Nancy recognized many of them, customers from the store. She saw Mrs. Chen, her face pale with shock. She saw the young construction worker who had warned her about the corners being cut. She saw Mayor Downing standing at the edge of the crowd in her bathrobe, her expression one of complete disbelief. Nancy took a deep breath and stepped forward, raising her voice to carry across the crowd. "Listen to me. I need everyone to focus." She was surprised by the strength in her own voice. "I worked in disaster relief for 15 years. We can help these people, but I need you to follow my instructions exactly. Do you understand?" The crowd stared at her. Some nodded. Others looked uncertain. Nancy did not wait for everyone to agree. Every second mattered. "You," she pointed to a tall man she recognized from the hardware store. "I need you to start organizing people into groups. I'm going to assign tasks, and you're going to make sure people know where to go and what to do." The man nodded, looking grateful to have something to do. Nancy continued, her voice growing more confident with each word. "You," she pointed to a teenage girl, "run to Thompson's. The store keys are in my jacket pocket at my apartment, but break a window if you have to. We need every flashlight, battery, blanket, and bottle of water you can carry. Take anyone who wants to help."
The girl nodded and ran off with a group of volunteers. "You," Nancy said to an older man, "organize a group to mark safe paths through the rubble. Use anything you can find, spray paint, rope, whatever. We need clear routes for emergency vehicles and rescue workers." More people stepped forward now, eager to help, waiting for direction. Nancy felt something stirring inside her, something that had been dormant for so long. It was not just her training coming back. It was purpose. "We need to listen for survivors," Nancy said to the crowd. "I want everyone to be absolutely silent for 30 seconds. If you hear anything at all, shout the location." The crowd fell silent. In that moment, with dozens of people holding their breath, Nancy could hear it. Voices. Multiple voices. People trapped beneath the rubble, calling for help. They were faint, but they were there. And this time, she was not going to be too late.
East section, someone shouted. I hear someone in the east section. North corner, another voice called. There's someone near the north corner. Southwest area, a third person yelled. Multiple voices. Nancy started organizing rescue efforts, dividing the crowd into teams. She knew the professionals were coming, that fire departments from multiple counties would be dispatched, that trained rescue workers would arrive. But every minute mattered. She had learned that lesson 5 years ago, in the cruelest way possible. Anyone with construction experience, medical training, or emergency response background, come with me, Nancy called. Everyone else, form groups of 5. Each group will be assigned to listen at different sections of the rubble. If you hear someone, mark the location and report back immediately. Do not try to move heavy debris alone. Do you understand?
The crowd organized itself with surprising efficiency. Nancy found herself at the head of a group of about 15 people with useful skills, including the young construction worker. You know these buildings, Nancy said to him. Where would the structural strong points be? Where might people have survived? The young man's face was ashen, but he pointed to several areas. The stairwells, maybe. They had reinforced cores, and some of the bathrooms were interior rooms with extra support. But honestly, with the way these buildings were constructed, he did not need to finish the sentence. Nancy knew what he meant. The buildings should never have been built the way they were. But that was a problem for later. Right now, there were people under the rubble who needed help. Nancy led her team to the east section, where the voices had been heard. She instructed people to spread out and listen carefully. She pressed her ear to a gap between 2 large slabs of concrete and heard it clearly. A woman's voice, frightened but strong. Help! We're trapped. There are 3 of us. Nancy's heart jumped. Can you hear me? She called down through the gap. Yes, I can hear you. Please help us. What's your name? Nancy asked, keeping her voice calm and steady. Jennifer Morrison. I'm here with my husband David and our neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. Jennifer, I'm Nancy. We're going to get you out. Can you tell me if anyone is injured? My leg is pinned, and Mrs. Patterson hit her head. David is okay, I think. Please hurry. Nancy turned to her team. We have 3 survivors here. 1 with a trapped leg, 1 with a possible head injury. We need to create an opening to assess the situation, but we have to be careful not to cause further collapse. She directed people to start carefully removing smaller pieces of debris from around the gap, creating a wider opening. The construction worker helped assess which pieces could be safely moved. It was slow, painstaking work, but gradually the opening grew larger. Nancy kept talking to Jennifer, keeping her calm, asking questions about their condition, their exact location, whether they could see any light. Every piece of information helped Nancy understand the situation better and plan the extraction. In the distance, Nancy could hear sirens approaching. Help was coming, but she could not wait. She had waited once before, and people had died. She would not let that happen again. As her team worked at the east section, Nancy kept moving between different groups, coordinating efforts, making sure people were not taking unnecessary risks. The supplies from Thompson's arrived, and Nancy distributed flashlights and water. She sent runners to update different teams on progress. She kept track of every location where voices had been heard. She found a young woman with medical training and asked her to prepare to provide first aid as survivors were extracted. She identified people with strong backs and assigned them to teams that would move heavy debris once it was safe to do so. She designated communication runners to maintain contact between different groups. The first fire truck arrived 20 minutes after the collapse. Nancy ran to meet the battalion chief, a grizzled veteran named Robert Hayes. Chief, I'm Nancy Martinez. I have disaster relief experience. We've identified at least 6 locations with confirmed survivors. I have teams marking safe approach routes and maintaining contact with the trapped individuals. Chief Hayes looked at the scene, then at Nancy. His initial skepticism was visible on his face. You organized all this? Yes, sir. We have about 50 volunteers following safety protocols. No one is moving heavy debris without supervision. I have a detailed map of where we've heard voices. She pulled out her phone and showed him the notes she had been taking. The chief's expression shifted from skepticism to respect. Good work. Show me what you have. Nancy led him through the disaster site, explaining what her teams had found. She pointed out the safe approach routes that had been marked. She introduced him to the construction worker who could provide information about the building's structure. She showed him where the Morrison family was trapped and explained the progress her team had made in creating an opening. As more emergency vehicles arrived, she helped coordinate between the volunteers and the professional responders. Fire departments from 3 counties were on scene now, along with county emergency management officials, and even a specialized urban search and rescue team from the state. But Nancy's volunteers continued to play a crucial role. They knew the site better than anyone else by that point. They had established relationships with the trapped survivors, keeping them calm and hopeful. And Nancy had organized them in a way that maximized efficiency without causing chaos. Chief Hayes pulled Nancy aside after surveying the scene. I want you working with my command staff. Your organization here is impressive. We need that kind of coordination as we scale up operations. Nancy nodded, feeling a sense of validation. This was what she had trained for. This was what she was meant to do. As dawn broke over Millbrook, the full scale of the disaster became visible in the harsh morning light. The 3 buildings had been reduced to rubble. Concrete slabs lay at impossible angles. Twisted rebar protruded from broken beams. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the debris field. A child's toy, a family photograph, a coffee mug. But amidst that destruction, there was hope. Nancy's quick response and organization had made a difference. The first survivor was brought out 2 hours after the collapse, bruised and frightened but alive. Then another. Then the Morrison family, all 3 of them, extracted carefully from their concrete prison. Each successful rescue was met with cheers from the volunteers and emergency workers. Nancy watched as families were reunited, as survivors were loaded into ambulances, as the impossible became possible through coordination and determination. Nancy worked through the morning and into the afternoon, coordinating between volunteers and professionals, tracking survivors, managing resources. She helped establish a command center in a nearby parking lot. She organized food and water for the rescue workers. She maintained communication with the survivors still trapped, keeping them hopeful, promising them they would be saved. By late afternoon, all the survivors who could be easily reached had been extracted. But there were still voices coming from deeper in the rubble. The rescue effort would continue for days, but the immediate crisis had passed. Nancy finally allowed herself to step back, to hand over coordination to the professional teams who were now fully established on site. She walked away from the disaster site, her clothes covered in dust, her hands scraped and bleeding, her body exhausted beyond anything she had felt in years. She found a quiet spot behind a rescue vehicle and sat down on the curb, her legs finally giving out.
That was when she allowed herself to feel it. The fear she had been holding back for hours. The memories of 5 years ago. The faces of the people she had not been able to save then, and the faces of the people she had helped save today. The emotions crashed over her like a wave, and Nancy found herself shaking, tears streaming down her dust-covered face. But they were different tears than the ones she had cried 5 years ago. These tears were not just for the loss and the tragedy. They were for the relief, for the lives saved, for the second chance she had been given to make a difference. They were tears of exhaustion and catharsis, of fear faced and overcome. A hand touched her shoulder. Nancy looked up to see Mrs. Chen standing there, holding a bottle of water. "You saved my grandson," Mrs. Chen said softly. "He lives in Building 2. He was in his apartment when it fell. You organized the team that pulled him out." Nancy took the water with trembling hands. "I'm glad he's safe." Mrs. Chen sat down beside her on the curb. "You tried to warn us. You tried to tell the mayor. You knew this would happen." Nancy nodded, too exhausted for words. "You're a hero, Nancy Martinez. You've always been a hero. We just didn't know it until tonight." Nancy shook her head weakly. "Heroes save people before disasters happen. I tried, but I failed." "You saved 19 people tonight," Mrs. Chen said firmly. 19 people who would have died if you hadn't been here, if you hadn't known what to do, if you hadn't organized all of us. That's not failure. That's heroism." Nancy looked back at the disaster site. Rescue workers were still carefully searching through the rubble. Emergency vehicles lined the streets. The community had come together in crisis, and she had helped make that happen. Maybe Mrs. Chen was right. Maybe heroism was not just about preventing disasters. Maybe it was also about how you responded when disaster struck. "I should have done more," Nancy whispered. "I should have found a way to make them listen." "You did everything you could," Mrs. Chen replied. "You followed the proper procedures. You tried to warn the authorities. They failed to listen, but that's not your fault. What matters is that when the moment came, you didn't freeze. You didn't run away. You ran toward the danger, and you saved lives. That's what makes you a hero." Nancy closed her eyes and let Mrs. Chen's words sink in. For 5 years, she had carried the guilt of the earthquake, the weight of the voices she could not save. Tonight, she had faced that fear head-on, and she had won. Not completely. 8 people had still lost their lives, but 19 had survived because she had been there, because she had acted, because she had refused to let the past paralyze her. The days following the collapse of the Maple Street buildings were a blur of activity, emotion, and revelation. Nancy found herself at the center of it all, though she had never sought that position. The rescue operation continued for 4 days. In the end, 19 people were pulled alive from the rubble, most of them in the first 36 hours. 8 people had lost their lives in the collapse: a young couple in their 20s, a retired schoolteacher, a single mother and her teenage daughter, and 3 elderly residents. 8 families who would never be whole again. 8 lives that could have been saved if someone had listened to Nancy's warnings. Nancy attended every memorial service, standing quietly in the back, her presence a somber reminder of both what had been saved and what had been lost. At each service, family members approached her. Some thanked her for trying to warn the town. Others simply held her hand, sharing their grief. Nancy absorbed it all, carrying the weight with a heavy but steady heart. The investigation into the collapse began immediately. State engineers and federal safety inspectors descended on Millbrook, examining the rubble, testing materials, reviewing construction documents. What they found confirmed Nancy's worst fears and vindicated her warnings. Riverside Construction, under the direction of Ronald Hendricks, had systematically violated building codes and safety regulations. The concrete used in the foundations and structural supports was significantly weaker than specified in the plans. Tests showed it was only 60% of the required strength. Rebar spacing was inadequate, with gaps up to 3 times larger than code allowed. Load-bearing walls had been constructed with substandard materials. The entire project had been a disaster waiting to happen. The investigation revealed even more disturbing details. Hendricks had used expired cement that he had purchased at a discount. He had substituted cheap imported rebar that did not meet American standards. He had cut the amount of steel reinforcement by nearly 40%. he had used inferior concrete additives that weakened the mixture further. Hendricks had saved hundreds of thousands of dollars by substituting cheap materials and cutting corners. He had bribed Building Inspector Davis with cash payments totaling $50,000 to overlook the violations. The inspector's signature appeared on multiple inspection reports, certifying work that had never been properly examined. In some cases, Davis had signed off on inspections before the work had even been completed. The state attorney general filed criminal charges against both Hendricks and Davis. The charges included fraud, bribery, reckless endangerment, and 8 counts of involuntary manslaughter. Both men were arrested and held without bail. The evidence against them was overwhelming: bank records, testimony from construction workers, material test results, and Nancy's photographs and documentation. Mayor Downing faced intense scrutiny as well. While investigators found no evidence that she had been directly involved in the bribery scheme, her dismissal of Nancy's warnings and her close relationship with Hendricks raised serious questions. It emerged that Hendricks had been a major campaign contributor to the mayor's last election. He had also hired the mayor's nephew to work on his projects. The county investigation also revealed that Nancy's complaint had been received and reviewed, but no action had been taken. The county inspector assigned to follow up had been overwhelmed with cases and had prioritized the complaint as low risk based on the existence of local inspection approvals. It was a failure of the system at multiple levels. A recall petition began circulating through Millbrook, signed by hundreds of residents who felt betrayed by their elected leader. The petition accused Mayor Downing of negligence, of prioritizing business relationships over public safety, and of failing to respond appropriately to credible warnings. Within 2 weeks, the petition had gathered enough signatures to trigger a recall election. Through it all, Nancy tried to return to her quiet life. She went back to work at Thompson's General Store, scanning groceries and stocking shelves. But everything had changed. People recognized her now. They thanked her. They asked her questions. They treated her like a hero, and she did not know how to handle that attention. Local news stations wanted interviews. National media picked up the story. Nancy found herself being called the Guardian of Millbrook in headlines. Her photograph appeared in newspapers across the country. People sent letters and emails thanking her, praising her, calling her an inspiration. But Nancy struggled with the attention. She did not feel like a hero. She felt like someone who had tried and failed to prevent a disaster, someone who had been forced to clean up a mess that should never have happened. The praise felt undeserved when 8 people had died. The young construction worker, whose name Nancy learned was Michael Torres, quit his job with Riverside Construction immediately after the collapse. He provided detailed testimony to investigators about the company's practices. He described how workers were told to use less concrete than specified, how rebar was spaced incorrectly, how inspections were staged to hide defects. Michael also tracked Nancy down at the store one afternoon, 3 weeks after the collapse. "I wanted to thank you," Michael said, "for listening to me, for believing me, for doing something." Nancy rang up his purchases slowly, not sure what to say. "You were brave to speak up. That took courage." "Not as much courage as you had," Michael replied. "You tried to warn everyone, even when no one would listen. And then when the worst happened, you didn't freeze up. You saved people. You saved my cousin. She was in Building 1, 3rd floor. She's alive because you organized that rescue." Nancy felt her throat tighten. "I'm glad she's safe." "I'm going back to school," Michael said, "to study civil engineering. I want to make sure buildings are safe. I want to be someone who actually checks the work, who doesn't let corners get cut. I want to be like you." After Michael left, Nancy found herself standing at the register, staring at nothing. She had spent 5 years trying to forget who she had been, trying to escape from the weight of responsibility and the burden of other people's lives. But the past had caught up with her anyway, and in the process, she had discovered something important. She had not just saved people on the night of the collapse. She had saved herself. The trauma of the earthquake 5 years ago had not disappeared. Nancy still had nightmares. She still heard those voices. But now there were new memories alongside the old ones. Memories of people she had helped save. Memories of her community coming together. Memories of the strength she had found within herself when it mattered most. One evening, Nancy received a phone call from an unfamiliar number. She almost didn't answer, tired of media requests and interview invitations. But something made her pick up. "Miss Martinez? This is Director Ellen Watkins from the State Emergency Management Agency. I'd like to talk to you about an opportunity." Over the next hour, Director Watkins explained that the agency had been following Nancy's story closely. They were impressed not just by her actions during the collapse, but by her attempts to prevent it, her documentation of safety concerns, and her to organize an effective response. "We'd like to offer you a position as a Regional Disaster Response Coordinator," Director Watkins said. "Your experience and your actions during the Maple Street crisis make you an ideal candidate. You'd be responsible for disaster preparedness training, coordinating emergency response efforts, and working with local communities to identify and address safety concerns." Nancy was quiet for a long moment. The position would mean more responsibility, more pressure, more exposure to disaster and tragedy. It would mean giving up the quiet, peaceful life she had built in Millbrook. It would mean facing her fears on a regular basis. But it would also mean making a real difference. It would mean using her skills to help people. It would mean being ready when the next crisis came. Because there was always a next crisis. It would mean being the person she was meant to be. "Can I think about it?" Nancy asked. "Of course," Director Watkins replied. "Take all the time you need. But I hope you'll seriously consider it. The world needs people like you, Nancy. People who have the courage to speak up, the knowledge to make a difference, and the heart to care about others." After hanging up, Nancy sat in her apartment, thinking about the offer. She thought about the past 5 years of running from her past. She thought about the night of the collapse, about the choice she had made to run toward the danger instead of away from it. She thought about Michael Torres deciding to become an engineer, about the families she had helped reunite, about the community that had come together in crisis. She thought about who she had been trying to become and who she actually was. The next morning, Nancy called Director Watkins back and accepted the position. A month after the collapse, Nancy received a call from the State Emergency Management Agency. They wanted to offer her a position as a Regional Disaster Response Coordinator. They said her experience and her actions during the Maple Street crisis made her an ideal candidate. Nancy thought about it for several days. The position would mean more responsibility, more pressure, more exposure to disaster and tragedy. It would mean giving up the quiet, peaceful life she had built in Millbrook. It would mean facing her fears on a regular basis. But it would also mean making a real difference. It would mean using her skills to help people. It would mean being ready when the next crisis came, because there was always a next crisis. Nancy called the Emergency Management Agency and accepted the position. When she gave her notice at Thompson's General Store, the owner, Gerald Thompson, smiled and shook her hand. "I always knew you were overqualified for this job," he said. "I just didn't know why you were here." "I needed time," Nancy said simply. "I needed to figure some things out." "And did you?" Nancy thought about the question. "I think so. I learned that you can't run from who you are, and I learned that sometimes the worst moments of your life can teach you the most important lessons." On her last day at the store, Nancy was surprised to find a crowd gathered outside when she arrived for her final shift. Dozens of people from the community had come to say goodbye. Mrs. Chen was there, along with her grandson, who Nancy had helped rescue. Michael Torres was there. Even the grumpy hardware store owner from next door had shown up. "We wanted to thank you properly," Mrs. Chen said, stepping forward with a plaque. "For everything you've done for this community." Nancy looked at the plaque. It read, "To Nancy Martinez, whose courage and leadership saved 19 lives and brought a community together. A true hero of Millbrook." Nancy felt tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll come back and visit us," Mrs. Chen said with a smile. "Say you'll remember us." "Always," Nancy promised. "I'll always remember." The crowd erupted in applause. People came forward one by one to shake her hand, to hug her, to tell her what she meant to them. Nancy felt overwhelmed by the love and gratitude, by the realization that her actions had touched so many lives in ways she had not fully understood. As the gathering dispersed, Mayor Downing approached Nancy. The mayor looked tired, older than she had just a month ago. The recall election was scheduled for the following week, and polls suggested she would lose badly. "I owe you an apology," Mayor Downing said quietly. "I should have listened to you. I should have taken your concerns seriously. If I had, those 8 people might still be alive." Nancy looked at the mayor, seeing genuine remorse in her eyes. "Thank you for saying that." "It doesn't change anything," the mayor continued. "It doesn't bring them back. But I want you to know that I will carry this with me for the rest of my life. I failed this community, and I failed you." Nancy nodded slowly. "We all have to live with our choices. What matters now is what you do next. How you learn from this. How you make sure others don't make the same mistakes." Mayor Downing smiled sadly. "I'm probably going to lose the recall election, but you're right. I can still try to make a difference, even if it's not as mayor. I can speak out about the importance of listening to safety concerns. I can advocate for better oversight. I can tell my story as a warning to other leaders." "That would be good," Nancy said. "That would be a positive legacy from all this tragedy." Nancy's new office was located in the state capitol, in a modern building that housed various emergency management departments. Her official title was Regional Disaster Response Coordinator, but as she quickly discovered, the role involved much more than just responding to disasters. It meant preparation, training, planning, and prevention. On her first day, Director Ellen Watkins laid out the scope of her responsibilities. Nancy would oversee disaster preparedness for 6 counties, coordinate training exercises, develop response protocols, and serve as a liaison between state and local emergency services. "I've read the reports about what you did in Millbrook," Director Watkins said during their initial meeting. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need. You didn't just react to the disaster. You organized people, maximized resources, and coordinated between civilians and professionals. That's rare." Nancy settled into her new role with surprising ease. The work was demanding, but it felt right in a way that stocking shelves never had. She traveled throughout her region, meeting with local emergency management officials, conducting training sessions, and reviewing disaster preparedness plans. One of her first major projects was developing a comprehensive building safety initiative. Working with state engineers and code enforcement officials, Nancy created a program to identify at-risk structures and ensure proper inspections. She thought of the Maple Street buildings every time she reviewed another inspection report, every time she flagged a potential safety concern. The program involved training local officials to recognize signs of construction defects, establishing independent inspection protocols, and creating a public database where citizens could report safety concerns. Nancy drew on her experience in Millbrook to design a system that would actually listen to warnings and take them seriously. She also started teaching. Once a month, Nancy led a community disaster response training course. She taught ordinary citizens how to respond effectively in emergencies, how to organize resources, how to provide aid until professional help arrived. the program quickly became popular, with waiting lists in multiple communities. During one of these training sessions, 6 months into her new job, Nancy met Daniel Okonkwo, a high school science teacher who had signed up for the course. Daniel was in his early 50s, with an easy smile and an obvious enthusiasm for learning. "I want my students to understand emergency preparedness," Daniel explained during a break. "After what happened in Millbrook, I realized we don't teach this stuff enough. Kids need to know how to respond in a crisis." Nancy found herself drawn to Daniel's passion for education. They talked for a long time about ways to incorporate emergency preparedness into school curricula. When the training session ended, Daniel asked if Nancy would be willing to come speak to his students. A week later, Nancy stood in front of 30 high school juniors, telling them about disaster response, community organization, and the importance of staying calm in a crisis. She talked about her experience in Millbrook, though she kept the emotional details to herself. The students listened with rapt attention, asking thoughtful questions. One student raised her hand. "Ms. Martinez, weren't you scared when the buildings collapsed? How did you know what to do?" Nancy considered the question carefully. "I was terrified. But I had training and experience, and I knew that people needed help. Being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you act despite your fear, because something is more important than your fear." "What was more important?" another student asked. "The lives of 19 people trapped under rubble," Nancy said simply. "The chance to make a difference. The knowledge that I had skills that could help, and if I didn't use them, people would die." After the presentation, Daniel walked Nancy to her car. "You're a natural teacher," he said. "Have you thought about doing more of this? More speaking to students? More education in general. Training is great, but prevention is better. If we can teach people about building safety, about recognizing risks, about demanding accountability from contractors and officials, maybe we can stop some disasters before they start."
Nancy considered this. It was true that she had focused primarily on response and preparedness. But Daniel was right. Prevention was even more important. Her mind drifted back to the warnings she had tried to give about the Maple Street buildings. What if more people had understood the risks? What if the community had been educated enough to demand better oversight? "You're right," Nancy said slowly. "I should be doing more prevention work." "We should do it together," Daniel suggested. "I know education. You know disasters. We could develop a real curriculum, something that gets implemented in schools across the state." And so, a new partnership began. Nancy and Daniel spent their evenings and weekends developing educational materials about disaster prevention, building safety, and community preparedness. They created lesson plans, instructional videos, and hands-on activities that made complex safety concepts accessible to young people.
Their friendship deepened through the work. Daniel had lost his wife to cancer 3 years earlier and had thrown himself into teaching as a way to cope with grief. Nancy understood that impulse, the need to find purpose in the wake of loss. They shared stories over coffee, compared notes over dinner, and gradually built something that went beyond professional collaboration. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Daniel admitted one evening as they reviewed curriculum materials in Nancy's apartment. "After Sarah died, I thought that part of my life was over." Nancy looked up from her laptop. They had been working together for nearly 4 months now, and she had come to value Daniel's presence in her life more than she wanted to admit. "I know what you mean," she said quietly. "After the earthquake 5 years ago, I shut down. I thought if I just kept to myself, kept things simple, I wouldn't have to feel that kind of pain again." "But then Millbrook happened," Daniel said. "Then Millbrook happened," Nancy agreed. "And I learned that you can't hide from life. Pain and loss are part of it, but so are purpose and connection. You have to take the whole package." Daniel reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm glad you're back in the world, Nancy Martinez." The world needs people like you." Nancy squeezed his hand, feeling something warm and hopeful stirring in her chest. "I'm glad you're in my world, Daniel Okonkwo." Their relationship grew slowly but steadily over the following months. They discovered shared interests beyond work, a love of hiking, a passion for old movies, a mutual appreciation for quiet mornings with good coffee. They learned each other's stories, their fears and hopes, their wounds and dreams. Daniel met Nancy's colleagues and learned about her work in detail. Nancy met Daniel's students and saw the impact he had on young lives. They supported each other through difficult days and celebrated successes together. They built trust, brick by brick, creating something solid and real. Meanwhile, back in Millbrook, the legal proceedings against Hendricks and Inspector Davis moved forward. The trial began 9 months after the collapse and lasted 3 weeks. Nancy was called as a witness, and she testified about her attempts to warn officials, about the visible defects she had observed, and about the events of that terrible night. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. They showed photographs Nancy had taken of the defective construction. They presented testimony from construction workers who described the shortcuts and substitutions. They demonstrated through material testing that the concrete and rebar were substandard. They traced the money trail from Hendricks to Inspector Davis. The defense attorneys tried to paint Nancy as an alarmist, someone whose past trauma had made her paranoid. But the physical evidence was overwhelming. The substandard materials, the code violations, the bribery scheme, all of it was documented and undeniable. During cross-examination, the defense attorney asked Nancy, "Isn't it true that you were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder related to a previous disaster?" "Yes," Nancy answered calmly. "I experienced trauma after failing to save lives in an earthquake 5 years ago, but that trauma didn't make me see problems that weren't there. It made me more vigilant about recognizing genuine safety issues. The defects I observed in those buildings were real, as subsequent investigation confirmed." "But you're not a structural engineer or a building inspector, are you?" "No, but I have 15 years of experience in disaster relief, which includes extensive training in assessing building stability and identifying structural damage. I know what unsafe construction looks like." The defense attorney tried several more approaches, but Nancy remained composed and credible. Her testimony was powerful because it was honest, detailed, and supported by evidence. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Hendricks was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Inspector Davis received 12 years. Both men were also ordered to pay millions in restitution to the victims and their families. When the verdicts were announced, Nancy was in the courtroom. She watched Hendricks's face as the judge read the sentence. There was no remorse there, only anger and bitterness. He glared at Nancy as he was led away in handcuffs, as if she was responsible for his downfall rather than his own choices. Outside the courthouse, families of the victims gathered. Some were crying with relief that justice had been served. Others looked exhausted, drained by months of legal proceedings. Nancy spoke with several of them, offering quiet comfort and support. "Thank you for not giving up," one woman said. She had lost her elderly mother in the collapse. "Thank you for trying to warn us, and thank you for testifying. You held them accountable." Mayor Downing did not face criminal charges, but she did face the voters. The recall election was held on a cold Tuesday in November, and she lost by a landslide. In her concession speech, she offered a brief apology for not listening to Nancy's warnings, though Nancy noticed she never mentioned her by name. The new mayor, a former school principal named Marcus Williams, reached out to Nancy shortly after taking office. He wanted her input on reforming Millbrook's building inspection process and creating better channels for citizen safety concerns. Nancy returned to Millbrook for the first time in months to meet with Mayor Williams. As she drove through the familiar streets, she was struck by how much had changed. The rubble from the Maple Street buildings had been cleared away. In its place, a memorial garden was being constructed, designed to honor those who had died and those who had survived. At the center of the garden would be a sculpture of clasped hands, representing community and support. Plaques would list the names of the 8 people who had perished. Benches would provide places for quiet reflection. The garden would serve as both a memorial and a reminder that safety must never be compromised, that warnings must be heard, that communities must look out for one another. Over the next year, Nancy's life became a rich tapestry of work, purpose, and personal growth. Her role as Regional Disaster Response Coordinator expanded. The curriculum she developed with Daniel was adopted by the State Education Department and began being taught in schools across the region. The Millbrook Community Emergency Response Team became a model for other small towns. The Building Safety Initiative Nancy had developed identified serious defects in 43 structures across her 6-county region in its first year. 17 buildings were immediately evacuated and either repaired or demolished. 26 others underwent mandatory remediation. Nancy's program had potentially saved hundreds of lives by catching problems before they became disasters, and her relationship with Daniel grew deeper. They moved slowly, both of them scarred by past losses and cautious about opening their hearts again. But gradually, trust and affection blossomed into love. They found comfort in shared purpose, strength in mutual support, and joy in simple moments together. Nancy also maintained her connection to Millbrook. She returned regularly to lead training sessions with the emergency response team. She attended the dedication ceremony when the memorial garden was completed. She stayed in touch with Mrs. Chen, with Michael Torres, and with many of the other people who had been part of that terrible night and its aftermath. Michael graduated from community college with honors and was accepted into a prestigious engineering program at the State University. He called Nancy to share the news. "I'm going to be a structural engineer," he said, his voice full of pride and determination. "I'm going to make sure buildings are safe. I'm going to be like you, Nancy. I'm going to make a difference." "You already make a difference, Michael," Nancy told him. "You spoke up when it mattered. You told the truth when it was hard. That's what makes a difference." "But I want to do more," Michael insisted. "I want to make sure what happened in Millbrook never happens anywhere else. I want to be the kind of engineer who puts safety above profit, who doesn't compromise on standards, who listens when someone raises concerns." "Then you will be," Nancy said with confidence. "You have the passion and the integrity. Those are the most important qualifications." 2 years after the Maple Street collapse, Nancy received an award from the state governor for her contributions to emergency management and disaster prevention. The ceremony was held in the state capitol, and Nancy was surprised to see how many people had come to support her. Daniel was there, of course, sitting in the front row. But so were Mrs. Chen and her family, Michael Torres, Director Watkins, and even Gerald Thompson from the general store. Mayor Williams had brought a delegation from Millbrook, including several members of the Community Emergency Response Team. And in the back of the room, Nancy spotted some of the survivors from the building collapse, people whose lives she had helped save that night. As she stood at the podium accepting the award, Nancy looked out at all those faces and felt a profound sense of gratitude. Not just for the recognition, but for the journey that had brought her here. The pain of 5 years ago had not disappeared. The memory of those voices she could not save still haunted her sometimes. But now there were new memories, too. Better memories. Memories of lives saved and communities strengthened. "I'm not a hero," Nancy said in her acceptance speech. "Heroes are ordinary people who refuse to give up when things are hard, who speak up when something is wrong, who help their neighbors in times of crisis. I've met hundreds of heroes over the past 2 years. They're teachers and construction workers and grocery store clerks. They're firefighters and volunteers and concerned citizens. They're everyone who has ever looked at a problem and said, I'm going to do something about this." She paused, looking directly at the survivors in the audience. 2 years ago, I tried to run from responsibility. I tried to hide from the weight of other people's lives. But a disaster in a small town taught me that we can't hide from who we are. We can't escape from our purpose. And we can't stop caring just because caring sometimes hurts. Nancy continued, her voice growing stronger. What happened in Millbrook was a tragedy. 8 people lost their lives because safety was ignored, because corners were cut, because warnings went unheeded. But from that tragedy, we've built something better. We've created systems to prevent future disasters. We've empowered communities to recognize and report safety concerns. We've trained thousands of people to respond effectively in emergencies. We've turned pain into purpose. The audience erupted in applause. Nancy felt tears prickling her eyes, but refused to let them fall. This moment was not about her emotions. It was about honoring the work, the community, and the hope that good could come from tragedy. After the ceremony, there was a reception. Nancy moved through the crowd, thanking people for coming, accepting congratulations, and reconnecting with old friends and colleagues. But the moment that meant the most came when a young woman approached her nervously. "Ms. Martinez? I'm Jennifer Morrison. You probably don't remember me." Nancy looked at the woman carefully, then recognition dawned. "You were trapped in Building 1. You, your husband, and your neighbor." Jennifer nodded, tears in her eyes. "You talked to me through the rubble. You kept me calm. You promised you'd get us out, and you did. My husband and I, we had a baby 6 months ago. We named her Nancy." Nancy felt her own eyes filling with tears. "You named her Nancy? Because of you, we're alive. Because of you, we have a family. We wanted our daughter to have a name that means strength and courage and hope. We wanted her to know about the woman who saved her parents' lives." Nancy embraced Jennifer, holding her tightly. This was why she had come back. This was why she had faced her fears. Not for awards or recognition, but for moments like this. For the knowledge that her actions had mattered, that her choice to step forward instead of running away had made a real difference in real lives. "Would you like to meet her?" Jennifer asked, gesturing to her husband who was standing nearby, holding a baby carrier. Nancy walked over and looked down at the infant girl, who had a tuft of dark hair and bright, curious eyes. Baby Nancy looked up at adult Nancy and smiled. "She's beautiful," Nancy whispered. "She's alive because of you," Jennifer's husband David said. "We both are. All 3 of us, me, Jennifer, and Mrs. Patterson. We owe you everything." Nancy shook her head. "You don't owe me anything. I just did what needed to be done." "That's what makes you a hero," David replied. "You did what needed to be done when no one else could or would." As Nancy held baby Nancy's tiny hand, she felt something shift inside her. The guilt she had carried for so long, the weight of those she could not save 5 years ago, felt lighter somehow. She could never bring those people back. She would always carry their memory. But she had also saved lives. She had made a difference. And that difference rippled outward in ways she could never fully comprehend. A baby named Nancy. A young man studying engineering. A community united and prepared. Systems changed to prevent future disasters. Hundreds of people trained to respond in emergencies. These were her legacies, born from tragedy, but built on hope. Chapter 5. Full Circle.
3 years after the Maple Street collapse, Nancy stood in front of a new building in Millbrook. But this building was different from the ones that had fallen. This building had been constructed with meticulous attention to safety, with proper materials, with constant oversight, and with community involvement at every stage. It was the new Millbrook Community Center, built on land donated by the town specifically for this purpose. The center would house emergency response training facilities, community meeting rooms, a library focusing on safety and disaster preparedness, and offices for local emergency management staff. The dedication ceremony was well attended. It seemed like half the town had turned out, along with state officials, emergency management professionals, and media from across the region. Nancy was there as a guest of honor, though she had insisted she did not need any special recognition. Daniel stood beside her, holding her hand. They had been engaged for 6 months now, planning a wedding that would take place in the memorial garden later that summer. Nancy wore the simple but elegant ring Daniel had given her, a constant reminder of the love and partnership they had built together. Mayor Williams stood at the podium, addressing the crowd. 3 years ago, our town experienced a tragedy that changed us forever. We lost 8 beloved community members. We saw 3 buildings collapse because corners were cut and safety was ignored. But we also saw something else. We saw a community come together. We saw ordinary people become heroes. And we saw one woman in particular show us what true courage looks like. He gestured toward Nancy. Nancy Martinez tried to warn us before the disaster happened. She followed proper channels and tried to raise the alarm. We should have listened. When the buildings fell, she did not hesitate. She organized rescue efforts that saved 19 lives. And in the years since, she has dedicated herself to making sure nothing like this ever happens again. Not just in Millbrook, but throughout the state. The mayor paused, looking around at the crowd. This community center represents our commitment to safety, to preparedness, and to listening when someone raises concerns. It represents our promise to honor those we lost by making sure their deaths were not in vain. And it represents our gratitude to Nancy Martinez for showing us what it means to be a true guardian of community safety. Nancy felt Daniel squeeze her hand. She had not wanted this attention, but she understood its importance. This was not really about her. It was about the community acknowledging what had happened, learning from it, and committing to do better. After the official ceremony, the community center opened for tours. Nancy walked through the training facilities, impressed by the quality of the equipment and the thoughtful design of the spaces. This center would serve Millbrook and the surrounding area for generations, teaching people how to respond to emergencies, how to stay safe, and how to look out for one another. In the memorial wing, Nancy stopped in front of a display that told the story of the Maple Street collapse. There were photographs, news clippings, and personal testimonies from survivors. At the center was a list of the 8 people who had died, with their photographs and brief biographies. Nancy read each name slowly, honoring their memory. Sarah Mitchell, age 24, kindergarten teacher. James Mitchell, age 26, software developer. Eleanor Hartman, age 71, retired librarian. Maria Gonzalez, age 35, nurse. Sophia Gonzalez, age 14, high school student. Robert Chen, age 68, retired postal worker. Margaret O'Brien, age 73, volunteer coordinator. Thomas Bradford, age 80, veteran and grandfather of 4. These were the people she had not been able to save. Their loss still weighed on her, but she carried that weight differently now. Not as a burden that crushed her, but as a responsibility that motivated her. Mrs. Chen found Nancy standing in front of the memorial. "You come here often?" the older woman asked gently. "First time," Nancy admitted. "I wanted to see how they honored them." "They did it well," Mrs. Chen said. "And because of what happened, because of how you responded, other lives have been saved. The Building Safety Initiative you helped create has already identified problems in dozens of structures across the state. The training programs you developed have prepared thousands of people to respond in emergencies. These 8 people didn't die in vain, Nancy. You've made sure of that. Nancy nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Mrs. Chen continued, My grandson is studying emergency management in college now. He says you inspired him. He wants to be a disaster response coordinator, just like you. That's your legacy, Nancy. Not just the people you pulled from the rubble, but everyone you've inspired to be better, to be prepared, to care about safety. That evening, there was a celebration dinner at Millbrook's nicest restaurant. Nancy sat at a large table with Daniel, Mrs. Chen, Michael Torres, Mayor Williams, and several members of the Community Emergency Response Team. The conversation flowed easily, full of laughter and warmth. Michael, now in his final year of engineering school, talked about his studies and his plans to work in building safety inspection after graduation. I want to be the kind of inspector who actually does the job right, he said. Someone who puts safety above everything else. The world needs people like that, Nancy said. People with integrity who won't compromise on what matters. I learned that from you, Michael replied. You didn't give up when no one would listen. You kept trying to warn people, and when the worst happened, you didn't freeze. You acted. Nancy thought about that night 3 years ago, about the moment when she had stood at her window and heard the crash, about her initial paralysis and the choice she had made to run toward the disaster instead of away from it. I almost didn't act, she admitted. I was terrified. All I could think about was the earthquake 5 years before, about the people I couldn't save then. But I realized something in that moment. Being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you act despite your fear. Daniel put his arm around her shoulders. That's what you teach in all your training sessions. That ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have the knowledge, the courage, and the support of their community. Exactly, Nancy said. That's what happened in Millbrook. Ordinary people became heroes that night. I just helped organize them. You did more than that, Mayor Williams said. You showed us what we're capable of. You showed us that one person speaking up, one person refusing to accept the status quo, one person willing to take responsibility, that can change everything. As the dinner continued, Nancy found herself reflecting on her journey. 5 years ago, she had been broken by trauma, running from responsibility, hiding from the weight of other people's lives. 3 years ago, she had been forced to confront everything she had been running from. And now she was whole again. Not undamaged, she would always carry the scars of her experiences, but healed in the ways that mattered most. She had found purpose again. She had found love again. She had found the courage to be who she truly was, not who she thought she should be to avoid pain. Later that night, Daniel and Nancy walked through Millbrook's streets. It was a beautiful evening, warm and clear, with stars visible above the small town's limited light pollution. They walked past Thompson's General Store, where Nancy had once spent her days in comfortable numbness. They walked past the Memorial Garden on Maple Street, where flowers had been placed in honor of those who had died. They walked through a town that had been forever changed by tragedy, but had emerged stronger and more united. Do you ever regret it? Daniel asked. Coming back to this kind of work? Putting yourself in situations where you might have to face trauma again? Nancy considered the question carefully. No, she said finally. I regret the years I spent running. I regret not being able to save those people 5 years ago, and I regret not being able to prevent what happened here. But I don't regret coming back. This is who I am. This is what I'm meant to do. And us? Daniel asked softly. Do you regret letting me into your life? Nancy stopped walking and turned to face him. You're the best thing that's happened to me in years. You helped me see that it's possible to move forward without forgetting the past. You showed me that opening your heart again is worth the risk. Daniel smiled and pulled a small box from his pocket. Nancy looked at him quizzically. They were already engaged. I know we're already planning the wedding, Daniel said, but I wanted to give you something special tonight. Open it. Nancy opened the box to find a delicate silver necklace with a small charm. Looking closer, she saw that the charm was in the shape of clasped hands, just like the sculpture in the memorial garden. So you always remember, Daniel said softly, the strength of community, the power of connection, the importance of holding on to each other through difficult times. Nancy felt tears streaming down her face, but they were happy tears, tears of joy and hope and love. Daniel fastened the necklace around her neck, and Nancy touched the charm, feeling its weight against her heart. Thank you, she whispered, for understanding, for being patient with me, for loving me even when I was struggling to love myself. Always, Daniel promised, kissing her gently. They continued their walk, hand in hand, talking about their upcoming wedding, about their plans for the future, about the life they were building together. Nancy felt a sense of peace she had not known in years. She had faced her demons and emerged victorious. She had found love in the aftermath of tragedy. She had built a life of meaning and purpose.
5 years after the Maple Street collapse, Nancy Martinez stood in front of a congressional committee in Washington, D.C. She was there to testify about building safety reform and the need for stronger federal oversight of construction practices. The hearing room was imposing, filled with lawmakers, journalists, and advocates. But Nancy had faced more frightening situations than this. She had pulled people from rubble. She had organized communities in crisis. She had rebuilt her own life from the ground up. This was just another opportunity to make a difference. Members of the committee, Nancy began. My name is Nancy Martinez. I am a regional disaster response coordinator, a disaster preparedness educator, and a survivor of 2 building collapse disasters. I am here to tell you that what happened in Millbrook was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger problem in how we approach building safety in this country. She spoke for 20 minutes, describing the Maple Street collapse, the violations that had caused it, and the systemic failures that had allowed those violations to occur. She talked about the 8 lives lost and the 19 lives saved. She discussed the reforms that had been implemented in response and the need to expand those reforms nationwide. Every year, thousands of Americans live and work in buildings that do not meet basic safety standards. Nancy told the committee. Every year, disasters that could have been prevented claim lives that could have been saved. We have the knowledge to build safe structures. We have the technology to inspect them properly. What we need is the will to enforce standards consistently and the courage to hold people accountable when they cut corners. The testimony was well received. Several committee members asked thoughtful questions. Nancy answered with the confidence of someone who had lived through the consequences of building safety failures and dedicated years to preventing them from happening again. Ms. Martinez, one senator asked, what would you say to other people who see safety problems but feel powerless to do anything about them? Nancy thought carefully before responding. I would say that your voice matters. Document what you see. Report it to the appropriate authorities. Don't give up if you're not heard the first time. Keep pushing. And if disaster does strike, be ready to help however you can. Every person who speaks up, who refuses to accept unsafe conditions, who takes responsibility for their community's welfare, that person is a hero. After the hearing, Nancy was approached by reporters wanting interviews, by advocates seeking her support for various initiatives, and by other survivors of building collapses who wanted to share their stories. She spent hours talking with people, listening to their experiences, offering advice and support. Late in the afternoon, as Nancy finally prepared to leave the Capitol building, a young woman approached her. She was in her early 20s, carrying a notebook and looking nervous, but determined. Miss Martinez? My name is Sarah Hendricks. I'm a journalism student at Georgetown. I wondered if I could ask you a few questions. Nancy noticed the last name, but did not comment on it immediately. Of course. What would you like to know? Sarah took a deep breath. I want to write about building safety reform for my senior thesis. But I also have a personal reason for being interested in this topic. Ronald Hendricks is my uncle. He's the contractor who built the buildings that collapsed in Millbrook. Nancy's expression softened. I see. That must be difficult for you. It is, Sarah admitted. My family has been torn apart by what happened. Some of them blame you for testifying against my uncle. Others are ashamed of what he did. I'm trying to understand it all, to make sense of how someone in my family could have done something so terrible. Nancy gestured to a bench, and they both sat down. Your uncle made choices that led to tragedy, Nancy said gently. But those were his choices, not yours. You're not responsible for his actions. I know that intellectually, Sarah said, but emotionally, it's harder. I keep thinking, if I had known, if someone in the family had known, could we have stopped him?
That's a question I've asked myself many times, Nancy said. If I had been more persistent in my warnings, if I had found a way to make people listen, could I have prevented the collapse? The truth is, we can't know. All we can do is learn from what happened and try to make sure it doesn't happen again. Sarah wiped her eyes. I want to be a journalist who focuses on accountability and safety. I want to investigate the systems that allow people like my uncle to get away with dangerous practices. I want to make sure that when someone like you tries to raise an alarm, people listen. Nancy smiled. That's a worthy goal. The world needs journalists who care about truth and accountability. Can I ask you something? Sarah said. How did you find the courage to keep going after everything you've been through? The earthquake 5 years before Millbrook, the trauma, the collapse itself. How did you not just give up?
Nancy thought about the question. It was one she had been asked many times, and the answer had evolved over the years. I think courage isn't about not being afraid, Nancy said. It's about deciding that something else matters more than your fear. For me, what matters more is making sure other people don't have to go through what I went through. What matters more is using my experience to prevent future tragedies. What matters more is showing up when I'm needed, even when it's hard. Sarah nodded, writing notes. Can I quote you on that? You can quote me on anything I've said today, Nancy replied. If my words can help you or anyone else, then use them. They talked for another 30 minutes. Sarah asked thoughtful questions about building safety, about disaster response, about the personal toll of this kind of work. Nancy answered honestly, holding nothing back. If this young woman wanted to dedicate her career to accountability and safety, Nancy would support her in any way she could. When they finally parted, Sarah thanked Nancy with genuine warmth. You've given me a lot to think about. And you've given me hope that even when terrible things happen, good people can make a difference.
Nancy watched Sarah walk away, feeling a sense of satisfaction. This was the real legacy of Millbrook. Not just the people she had pulled from the rubble, not just the reforms she had helped implement, but the ripples that spread outward from that night. Michael Torres becoming an engineer, Sarah Hendricks becoming a journalist focused on accountability, Mrs. Chen's grandson studying emergency management, countless others inspired to care about safety, to speak up when something is wrong, to show up when they are needed. That evening, Nancy returned to her hotel room and called Daniel. He had stayed behind to teach summer classes, but they talked every night when she traveled. How did the testimony go? He asked. I think it went well. There's genuine interest in reform. Whether that interest translates into actual legislation remains to be seen, but at least people are paying attention. They're paying attention because you're making them pay attention, Daniel said. That's what you do, Nancy. You make people see what they've been ignoring. Nancy smiled, feeling grateful for his support. I met someone interesting today. Ronald Hendricks' niece. She's a journalism student who wants to focus on accountability and safety. What was that like? Daniel asked carefully. It was good, actually. She's trying to understand what happened and figure out how she can make sure it doesn't happen again. She's taking responsibility for change, even though she's not responsible for what her uncle did. That takes real courage. Like someone else I know, Daniel said warmly. They talked for another hour, discussing the testimony, Nancy's upcoming schedule, and their plans for the wedding, now just weeks away. They had decided on a ceremony in the Memorial Garden on Maple Street. It seemed appropriate to celebrate new beginnings in a place that had been marked by both tragedy and resilience. I can't wait to marry you, Daniel said softly. I can't wait to start this next chapter together. Me too, Nancy replied. You've made me believe in new beginnings. You've shown me that it's possible to build something beautiful after loss. The next morning, Nancy caught an early flight home. As the plane lifted off from Washington, she looked down at the city below, thinking about all the people working to make things better, safer, and more just. Change was slow and difficult, but it was possible. She had learned that lesson in the hardest way imaginable. Nancy took out her notebook and began writing notes for her next training seminar. She was scheduled to speak to a group of city planners and building inspectors in 2 weeks. She wanted to make sure they understood not just the technical aspects of building safety, but the human cost of failure. She thought about the 8 people who had died in Millbrook. She thought about the people she had not been able to save 5 years before that. She thought about all the voices calling for help that she had heard in her nightmares for so long. But now, when she heard those voices, she also heard other voices. The voices of the 19 people she had helped save. The voices of students she had taught. The voices of emergency responders she had trained. The voices of communities she had helped prepare. The voices of lives touched and changed by her work. Those voices were louder now. Those voices drowned out the old nightmares and replaced them with something better. Not hope exactly, but something more solid. Purpose. Meaning. The knowledge that her presence in the world made a difference. Nancy closed her notebook and leaned back in her seat, watching the clouds drift past the airplane window. She was 48 years old when the Maple Street buildings collapsed. She was 53 now, older and wiser and stronger. She had faced her worst fears and emerged on the other side. She had found love, purpose, and community. She had learned that heroism was not about being fearless, but about acting despite fear. The journey had been long and painful, but Nancy would not change it. Every challenge had taught her something important. Every setback had made her more determined. Every loss had deepened her commitment to prevention and preparedness. As the plane began its descent, Nancy thought about the week ahead. She had 3 training sessions scheduled, 2 meetings with state emergency management officials, and a final planning session for the wedding. She had dinner plans with Daniel, coffee plans with an old colleague, and a promise to call Mrs. Chen to catch up. Her life was full, busy, and meaningful. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The girl who had once tried to hide from responsibility had become a woman who embraced it. The disaster relief worker who had walked away in trauma had returned stronger and more capable than before. The plane touched down smoothly. Nancy gathered her belongings and prepared to disembark. Daniel would be waiting for her at the airport, ready to wrap her in a warm embrace and hear about her trip. They would drive home together, talking and laughing, planning their future. And tomorrow, Nancy would wake up and continue the work. There were people to train, communities to prepare, safety standards to advocate for, and lives to protect. The work would never be finished, but that was okay. Nancy was no longer running from responsibility. She was running toward it, one step at a time, one day at a time, one life at a time. The wedding day arrived in late June, 5 years and 2 months after the Maple Street collapse. The memorial garden had been transformed with white chairs arranged in neat rows, an archway woven with flowers, and ribbons fluttering in the gentle breeze. The sun shone brightly, and the temperature was perfect, warm but not too hot. Nancy stood in a small room at the community center, looking at herself in the mirror. She wore a simple but elegant cream-colored dress that Daniel had helped her choose. Around her neck was the silver necklace with the clasped hands charm. Her hair was styled simply, and she wore minimal makeup. She looked like herself, which was exactly what she wanted. Mrs. Chen knocked on the door and entered, her own elegant dress complementing the occasion. "You look beautiful, dear," she said, tears already forming in her eyes. "Thank you for being here," Nancy said. "For everything." "Where else would I be?" Mrs. Chen replied. "You're family now, Nancy. You've always been family to this town." There was another knock, and Jennifer Morrison entered, carrying baby Nancy, now a lively toddler who was starting to walk. "We wanted to give you something before the ceremony," Jennifer said. Baby Nancy toddled toward adult Nancy, holding out a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked herself. "For Nancy," the little girl announced proudly. Adult Nancy knelt down and accepted the flowers, her eyes filling with tears. "Thank you, sweetheart. They're perfect." "You saved her parents," Jennifer said quietly. "And now she gets to see the woman she's named after get married." It's a beautiful circle. The ceremony began at 3 o'clock. Nancy walked down the aisle without anyone giving her away. She had given herself away long ago to fear and trauma, and now she was reclaiming herself, walking toward love on her own 2 feet. Daniel stood at the altar, his eyes shining with emotion as he watched her approach. The officiant was Mayor Williams, who had been ordained specifically to perform the ceremony. He spoke about resilience, about finding light in darkness, about the power of community and the strength of love. "Nancy and Daniel have both known loss," Mayor Williams said. "They have both faced darkness. But they found each other in the aftermath of tragedy, and they built something beautiful together. Their love is a testament to the human spirit's ability to heal, to grow, and to hope again." Nancy and Daniel exchanged vows they had written themselves. Daniel spoke of Nancy's courage, her compassion, and her unwavering commitment to helping others. Nancy spoke of Daniel's patience, his understanding, and his ability to see the best in her, even when she could not see it herself. "You taught me that it's okay to be broken," Nancy said, her voice steady despite her emotions. "You taught me that healing doesn't mean forgetting, but rather learning to carry our scars with grace. You taught me that love is worth the risk, even when we're afraid of losing again." When Mayor Williams pronounced them married, the garden erupted in applause. Nancy and Daniel kissed, and for a moment, the world fell away. There was only this love, this moment, this new beginning built on the foundation of everything they had both survived. The reception was held in the community center. Tables were filled with food, laughter, and celebration. Speeches were given, toasts were made, and stories were shared. Michael Torres talked about how Nancy had inspired him to pursue engineering. Mrs. Chen's grandson spoke about deciding to study emergency management. Director Watkins praised Nancy's contributions to disaster preparedness across the state. But the most touching moment came when Jennifer Morrison stood to speak, baby Nancy in her arms. 5 years ago, I was trapped under rubble, terrified that I would die, Jennifer said, her voice trembling. But I heard a voice, Nancy's voice. She promised me she would get me out, and she did. She saved my life, my husband's life, and our neighbor's life. Because of Nancy, I'm standing here today. Because of Nancy, my daughter exists. Because of Nancy, our family has a future. Jennifer paused, composing herself. But Nancy would tell you she's not a hero. She would say she was just doing what needed to be done. And that's exactly what makes her a hero. She doesn't seek glory or recognition. She simply shows up when she's needed and does what's right, even when it's hard, even when it's scary, even when she's facing her own demons. The room was silent except for the sound of people sniffling and wiping their eyes. So I want to propose a toast, Jennifer continued, raising her glass. To Nancy Martinez Okonkwo, because yes, you two decided to hyphenate, which makes you even more modern and wonderful. To a woman who has dedicated her life to keeping people safe, to preventing disasters, and to helping communities prepare for the worst, while hoping for the best. May your marriage be filled with the same courage, compassion, and commitment that you bring to everything you do. To Nancy. To Nancy! The room echoed, glasses raised high. Nancy stood and hugged Jennifer, both women crying openly now. Daniel wrapped his arms around both of them, and baby Nancy, caught in the middle of this emotional sandwich, giggled with delight. The celebration continued late into the evening. Nancy and Daniel danced their first dance to a song Daniel had chosen, Here Comes the Sun by the Beatles, because Nancy had told him once that emerging from her depression after the earthquake had felt like the sun finally breaking through years of clouds. As the evening wound down, Nancy found herself standing in the memorial garden alone, looking at the plaques with the names of the 8 people who had died. Daniel came to stand beside her, slipping his hand into hers. You okay? He asked softly. Yeah, Nancy said. I just wanted a moment with them. To let them know that I haven't forgotten, that I'll never forget. They would be proud of you, Daniel said, of what you've built from this tragedy, of the lives you've saved and the changes you've made. I hope so, Nancy whispered. I really hope so. They stood there together in the fading light, honoring the past while embracing the future. Then they walked back to the celebration, hand in hand, ready for whatever came next. 5 years later, Nancy Martinez Okonkwo stood in her office, looking at the wall of photographs and awards that documented a decade of work in disaster preparedness and response. She was 58 years old now, with more gray in her hair, but the same determined look in her eyes. The educational curriculum she and Daniel had developed was now taught in schools across 15 states. The Building Safety Initiative had identified and addressed problems in over 300 structures. The Community Emergency Response Training Program had certified more than 10,000 volunteers. Lives had been saved, disasters had been prevented, and communities had been strengthened. Michael Torres had graduated with his engineering degree and was now working as a structural engineer for the state, inspecting buildings and ensuring they met safety standards. He had already flagged several dangerous structures and prevented potential disasters. He called Nancy regularly to update her on his work and to thank her again for inspiring him. Sarah Hendricks had become an investigative journalist specializing in construction safety and government accountability. Her articles had exposed corruption in multiple cities and led to significant reforms. She credited Nancy with showing her that one person's courage could inspire systemic change. Mrs. Chen's grandson had completed his degree in emergency management, and was now working as a coordinator in a neighboring state. He had implemented many of Nancy's training protocols and was building his own reputation as an innovative thinker in the field. Baby Nancy was now 6 years old and starting first grade. Jennifer sent photos regularly, showing a bright, curious child who loved to help others, just like her namesake. The Millbrook Community Center had become a regional hub for emergency preparedness training. Thousands of people had passed through its doors, learning skills that might one day save lives. The Memorial Garden remained a place of reflection and remembrance, a testament to both loss and resilience. Daniel knocked on Nancy's office door, carrying 2 cups of coffee. They had been married for 5 years now, and every day Nancy felt grateful for his presence in her life. "Ready for your meeting?" he asked. Nancy was about to meet with a group of young professionals who wanted to start a national advocacy organization focused on building safety reform. They had reached out to her for guidance, inspiration, and endorsement. "Ready," Nancy said, taking the coffee and kissing her husband. "Let's change the world, one building at a time." As she walked to the conference room, Nancy thought about the journey that had brought her here. From the depths of trauma and despair to a life of purpose and meaning. From running away from responsibility to running toward it. From being broken to being whole. Not perfect, never perfect, but whole in the ways that mattered. She thought about the earthquake 10 years ago that had shattered her. She thought about the Maple Street collapse that had forced her to face her fears. She thought about all the people she had met along the way, all the lives that had touched hers, all the moments that had shaped who she had become. Nancy Martinez Okonkwo was a hero, though she still struggled to accept that title. But she had learned that heroism was not about grand gestures or dramatic moments. It was about showing up every day, doing the work, speaking truth to power, and refusing to give up even when things were hard. It was about turning pain into purpose, tragedy into transformation, and fear into action. It was about being a guardian of safety, of truth, of community, of hope. And as Nancy entered the conference room to meet with the next generation of advocates and reformers, she knew that her work was far from over. There would always be buildings that needed inspection, communities that needed training, and disasters that needed prevention. But she was ready. She had faced her demons and won. She had built a life of meaning from the rubble of tragedy. She had loved and been loved in return. She had made a difference. One life at a time, one community at a time, one day at a time. At Nancy Martinez Okonkwo, the silent guardian who had found her voice, was ready for whatever came next. And she would face it with courage, compassion, and an unshakable commitment to making the world a safer place for everyone. The journey continued. The work continued. The hope continued. And Nancy continued, stronger and more determined than ever before. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.